Hello, everybody. I am Salvador Carrillo, psychologist and psychotherapist. This is the channel Terapia Carrillo. Today, we are speaking with a very important person. I'm gonna chat with Steve Johnson. He's the co-founder of the Connecticut Center for Cognitive Behavioral and Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy and the current president of the Albert Ellis Institute. He's also a philosopher. He has taught courses in logic, ethics, and more in the University of Indianapolis. Hello, Mr. Johnson. How are you?
I'm doing great. And how are you, Salvador?
I am very happy to be chatting today with you. Please, Mr. Johnson, what is your definition of REBT?
Wow. There is a very long definition, but I will give you the elevator definition, right? Rational emotive behavior therapy is one of the second wave behavioral models that focuses primarily on the disturbance in the present and those emotions, dysfunctional emotions, behaviors, and even physiological responses that are due largely through dysfunctional beliefs that we hold. Of course, situations and events always, have a huge impact upon us, but even greater impact if we hold dysfunctional beliefs about those situations and events. So that kind of separates us from those um, more psychodynamically oriented that would, explore the past a bit more than we would. We
Mhm.
both agree that the past is relevant. Our focus is on those symptoms in the present and what we can do to help an individual not only have some symptom alleviation, but actually replace some of those symptoms and actually have a more resilient, self, especially when those symptoms may persist over a long period of time.
Some people, especially patients, people that want to take REBT, sometimes ask me if REBT is a cognitive therapy. Of course it is, but please can you explain what is a cognitive behavioral therapy and why REBT is one of those?
Well, I think of REBT as under the umbrella of cognitive therapies,
Hmm.
largely because we do emphasize to a considerable extent the relationship between those cognitions, emotions, behaviors, and even, as I said, physiological responses. However, it's more than a cognitive therapy, right?
Right.
Because we look at behavioral interventions, cognitive interventions, and emotive interventions. And more importantly, where we look at that structure in which they reside, which is the self, right?
Hmm.
And so we are, you know, cognitive plus, I would say, in terms of that. And I think in part because um, some people have a misunderstanding about REBT, and they think that we believe that it's a very linear model, right? That there's an event, and then we develop beliefs about that event, and then that's the cause of those consequences, those three consequences that I named. But that's never been the model. That's a gross oversimplification of the model, because we would say emotions, behaviors, physiological responses, beliefs, those are all interconnected, and it's almost an artificial distinction among them,
And
right?
in parallel at the same time.
At the same time, and co-influencing, which we see that as great news. Let's say that we've, let's say we started with a cognitive intervention and we're not getting much traction with that. The individual may respond better to behavioral interventions or emotive interventions, right? So I like it that it's more complicated than very linear, right?
The creator of REBT was a man called Albert Ellis, who was
Yes.
a very important figure in the history of psychotherapy. also a great lecturer, a great writer. What can you tell us about this person who was Albert Ellis and his legacy?
I'm smiling every time I talk about Albert Ellis because I had the great fortune of having him as my mentor, right?
Yes, and
And
excuse me, let me interrupt you for a second. Albert Ellis came to Peru, and
oh, he did.
yes, he came once, and his picture is in the School of Psychologists, the official School of Psychologists, and he is there as an honorary member, and you can see his picture over there.
Oh,
Yes,
how
and
nice.
he spoke in different universities and was very special for us Peruvians to have him over here. So please continue.
Oh, that's really nice to hear because Albert, he would never let us call him Dr. Ellis. He always insisted that we call him by his first name because he said we're all equal. We're all messed up, so we might as well just call each other by the first name. But he was a wonderfully pragmatic individual. He began with as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and he found that a good number of the clients took a long time, right, to make some changes. And he was having in a session once with the female client, and she was upset about something about her father, and and happened upon an insight that she said, "Oh, are you telling me that it's not my father that disturbed me? It's what I'm thinking about my father?" And Albert heard her very well, and that was the birth of back then rational therapy, right? Its name has changed over time. And so he always joked. He said, Freud had a gene for inefficiency, he had a gene for efficiency, and he wanted to get a collaborative relationship, almost like a coaching relationship with the client as an equal. He moved into intervention in the very first session, because his take was when people come in, they want hope.
And what I have always found really interesting about him is that before being a psychotherapist, he was a very famous sexologist.
He was
Yeah.
before his time. And in fact, he was going to write a dissertation at Columbia University on that topic, and he was going to interview the students at the university on their sexual behavior, but the university didn't want that to happen. That was years ago because they were worried that the parents would hear that their children were having sex and would be all upset. So he had to change his dissertation topic, but he was very, very interested in that throughout his life.
Yes, there is a beautiful story that he always spoke about, that he began his philosophical and psychological thinking when he was 19 years old, and he was very shy with women. Can you please tell us that story? I think that people would find it really interesting. Hmm.
He asked first one out on a date. 98 said no. These were perfect strangers. 98 said no. Two said yes, but then they didn't show up for the date. and so, and he had a decision. He goes, do I just stop and just become a monk, or do I start again? And so he started in on the second group of 100, and there he did get a date. And so he said, you just need not to disturb yourself when reality doesn't go the way you want. Stay in there, deal with your frustration, intolerance, and move on in life.
Yes, and the importance there of the behavioral part. That also,
Absolutely.
that is also what Emerson says. That the experience, having experience, doing experiments, and try to open yourself to life through behavior, through experimental behavior.
Yeah, in fact, Albert and I talked about this because it was way back. It was William James
Hmm.
who really hit upon that idea when he said, act as if you already had accomplished something, you know, and that is behavioral. And so act into the future and in the present, the way that you want to be, right?
Mhm. I think it would be very interesting to listen your definition of, for you, what is a mentally healthy person?
Oh boy. You mean that imaginary creature? Let's see. Because Albert said we're all kind of a mess, and that's wonderfully liberating to think about that. It's a great equalizer, right? But I think it is someone who um, actually deals with reality as it is without unduly disturbing themselves about that reality, right?
Mhm.
We accept it. We accept the reality about ourselves, about others, about life in the world. And once we accept it, rather than thinking it should be different than it is, I mean, work to change it to the degree that you want, but sometimes we can't change reality, right? And
Mhm.
so he says, accept that, move on, don't tend to disturb yourself, and to try to minimize the disturbing of yourself about that.
Yes, and I think here we can introduce that wonderful concept of the shoulds and should not,
Yes.
right? This rigid thinking that I must be this and must be that, which is absolutely central in REBT.
In fact, Albert would call that demandingness, right? And he said that is the core disturbance producing belief. There are those that we add to it, but the demandingness is enough to disturb us, right? Because especially when the demand, I mean, he said it's kind of we set ourselves up as God, you know, that we demand that reality be the way that we want, and reality doesn't know it's supposed to act according to our demand, and the discrepancy will lead to emotional disturbance. So instead of that kind of rigid thinking, we want flexible thinking that is focused on reality rather than just imaginatively demanding the way things should be, right?
You as a philosopher must have a interest of in the philosophical basis of REBT. REBT has a lot of influence of the school of the Stoics
Right.
and also from some Oriental thoughts as Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and Taoism.
Yep.
What can you comment us about this, please?
Well, I do have a PhD in philosophy. I was an analytic philosopher, so I didn't spend a lot of time in ancient philosophies. Mine was more on linguistic analysis, you know,
I
as the
understand.
United States and Great Britain were. But, you know, I was interested in the history of philosophy. It wasn't my specialty. Mine was in logic and analytic epistemology. But I did go back and study the Stoics and found them to be, you know, quite rational and accepting of reality in a very healthy very healthy way. And Al was most impressed by Epictetus,
Yes.
and but not just them. I mean, he was also he and I would talk about the impact of John Dewey or Paul Tillich, you know, more existential
Hmm.
philosophers. Um, so there, he pulled from a lot of philosophers. I'll never forget, and I hope you, I'm not causing you any problems by
No, no,
telling
not
you
at
this
all, please.
story. But when I had written Albert a letter and I said, you know what, I'm very interested in REBT, particularly the application. How do we treat people who generally reject psychology, particularly those who are deeply religious, right? And I was very interested in Jews, Christians, and Muslims who rejected psychology. And I wrote to him, and he called me and he said, "Get your rear end down here. I'm going to interview you," right? Because he was very interested. He was reading about religion at the time,
Mm.
and he was um, he said, Steve, I'm more interested in your background in philosophy than in your background in psychology because I know that you will think rationally, right? And it was true. I mean, he really, really valued that. And it was a great blessing for me that I had, I had hours and hours to get to spend time picking his brain about how he understood those philosophers and who he was influenced by.
Beliefs have a great impact in our feelings. We spoke about this must and must not. You said we have the tendency to think like God, that life must be like we think must be, life must be as as how it is easier for us. Why does people have this tendency? Because there are other uh, psychotherapy schools that says that human beings have the tendency towards being rational or feeling good, etc. But that tendency is suppressed. Albert Ellis said something different with which I agree, that human
Yeah.
beings are irrational, and that irrationality causes their disturbance mainly. Why does human beings have this tendency towards this rigid thinking and this must and must not, this shoulds and should nots?
Um, you know, I wish I had the answer to that one. I mean, we Albert says that we were born with this tendency toward irrationality. And I mean, if you open the newspaper or turn on the news, you pretty well see that that's the case. I know as a philosopher, um, that I often say, and we don't say it in our EBT, but it's true philosophically, that what is what is logical may not be what is ontological, right?
Mm-hmm.
That simply because we think a logical thought doesn't mean that we're going to act logically, right?
Right,
Would be nice if that happened, but there's a discrepancy, right?
right.
And and in fact, there's great proof for that one because if reality followed logic, then there would be no need for science. We would just get scientists in a room and say, think logical thoughts so that we know exactly the way reality is, right? But we don't. We have to do some research. And I think that we also confuse ourselves about what is logical, right? And I think culturally, we're at a point in the world, at least in Western culture, that we believe that what is true for you may be not true for somebody else. I mean, we say that, but we can't live that way. You know
Of
what I mean?
course.
We have to have some intersubjectively agreed upon truths, right? And based on that, we can determine what's logical and not logical. However, one point about truth in REBT, you know, in philosophy we talk about three major theories of truth, right? The correspondence theory, that the truth of a proposition is if it corresponds to reality, right? Or coherence, if we have a set of propositions and they have to cohere in order for those propositions to be true. But Albert really embraced a pragmatic theory of truth, that the truthfulness of a proposition, that an inference, is in the consequences of living that truth. And we might say the same thing for a belief, right?
Something that
That
also William James said, right?
he did.
Yeah.
He did. Yeah, in several places. William James, John Dewey, Charles Saunders Peirce, all of those American pragmatists kind of, took that view of truth. And Albert Ellis certainly does that.
Yeah, but I have the feeling that Albert Ellis had that pragmatic approach for pragmatical reasons
He, you know,
for the therapy, for the psychotherapy, not necessarily as a philosophical position.
no, in Albert, it was sometimes hard to distinguish those, but
Uh,
across the board, he was extremely, you know, pragmatic about things, and in that way he lived kind of a, you know, somewhat stress-free life. I mean, I asked him whether he ever got anxious. He said one time, and I said, what happened? He goes, I was flying to Australia and we hit turbulence and I started getting anxious. And I said, what were you thinking? He goes, I was telling myself that I was just going to, you know, the plane was going to fall out of the sky and I was going to go to my death. And I said, so did you get over it? And he goes, yeah. And I said, what did you say? And he went, I said, you're going to be dead. You won't feel anything. So get over it. You know? So, I don't know if that works for everybody, but it worked for Albert, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Is mindfulness compatible with REBT, and how so?
In a very specific way, because many people think that REBT is primarily about cognitive restructuring, right? It's never the case within REBT. Albert always said that there is a role for distractions, right? That if we distract ourselves, we may be able to calm ourselves enough so that we will have the mental presence to then do the dispute so that we get the long-term cognitive, cognitive change that we need. But he valued those, what he would call distractions. Many people think that's pejorative, that he was putting it down, but he thought that was quite valuable to engage in those. Not that alone, though, right?
Of course.
It was not about mindfulness only. And he didn't want us to take a magical view of mindfulness, but as part of the toolbox of psychotherapy, right?
Albert Ellis had a strong skeptic posture, right? Towards religion, towards magical thinking. He criticized especially therapists that had certain mystical base, like for example, Carl Gustav Jung. This skepticism, how do you see it reflects inside REBT?
Well, Albert changed on this matter, and he changed about, I think, just a few months before I got to the Institute. He got very interested in religion and began to listen to those individuals who were actually religious but practiced REBT. And so he said, yeah, there's a function for religion. It's not religion that is the problem, it's religiosity. You know, rigidly holding to something and saying that others must believe that, you know, so, or is the dogmatism of religion that he was against, not about, you know, the practices and even some of the, but he said, you know, you could have that religiosity toward anything, socialism, you know, capitalism, REBT, you know, you could be dogmatic about it, you know.
I read very interesting transcript of a talk he did about Zen Buddhism, about REBT being a vehicle for ego transcendence. And I would love to listen to you to talk about a little bit about this interest in ego transcendence and how he saw especially Buddhism, which is nowadays um, a special topic that investigators are digging into. What can you tell us about it?
Well, part of this will just be me, because the first research I did as a philosopher was on the nature of the self, right? I was still in graduate school when I published that first paper on the nature of the self, and came to the conclusion, probably that Hume did and Albert Ellis, and that there really is probably no self, but the concept of the self is helpful, right? Um, and Albert felt the same way about ego. I mean, I sometimes I use those terms interchangeably. A Freudian
Of
wouldn't,
course.
right?
Right, right.
But whatever it is, this ontological entity, right? Which I don't think there's any evidence for, but fine, people believe in it. It's what you believe about it, whether it's helpful or not helpful. But if you, I think Albert's position on this was very clear, that if you evaluate yourself based upon this conception of this ego or self, then that's going to cause some deleterious emotions and behaviors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So better, even if there is a self, just leave it alone, right? Just, treat it like it's a self just sitting there doing what? Selfing, okay? But just don't evaluate it. And my good friend, Jim McMahon, and I worked on this for a few years, but to separate your behaviors and your roles from the self, evaluate your behaviors within the roles, depending on what your goals would be within that role, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that you could improve. Leave the self alone, because whatever you choose to evaluate that is going to be purely arbitrary, right?
Like saying it in a simple way, criticize the behavior, not criticize yourself.
Absolute. Have you met those guys who think they are God's gift to women and there's no empirical evidence to support it? But they're evaluating themselves positively, Now
Yeah.
think about if they evaluated themselves poorly.
Yeah.
And so that's why Albert did not like the self-esteem movement. He said, the problem with self-esteem is it tends to be to evaluate yourself more highly or more positively than you normally would. He said they don't get it. The problem is the evaluation, not evaluating high or low. Because if you evaluate yourself too low, you're going to be, have a tendency toward depression. Evaluate yourself too high, people don't like you. No.
Yes, and you are also creating the field to feel easier victimized.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He said a wonderful thing that was, but unhealthy positive emotion. It
That's
feels
right.
good. It feels good, but it's not healthy.
That's right. He separated positive emotions from negative emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Positive emotions are those that feel good. Negative emotions are those that don't feel good, and we don't want them. And if you're a normal human being, you don't want them. I guess there's masochism and sadism. Those are the different thing, right? But positive emotions can be healthy or unhealthy, just as negative emotions can be healthy or unhealthy. I often give the example, if you're a parent and your child has 104-degree fever and you're happy, that's a
There's something
positive
wrong with you.
emotion, but you will not take steps to get that fever down, right? Yeah.
Yeah. He, I believe, always said that it's very important to listen to our feelings. And I have the impression that REBT critics that usually haven't studied anything of REBT and just criticize says, oh, it's too rational, it's against feelings. And it's absolutely the opposite. I think that REBT is absolutely about listening to your feelings and desires.
Absolutely. Absolutely listen to them. And also, because if you have unconditional self acceptance and unconditional acceptance of the other, even if those emotions are not helpful, we still will accept you,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it would be better if you accept yourself, because if you put yourself down, it's generally not going to be helpful. If I can give an example, because I'll give one from addictions, because that's one of my specialties, right? So let's say I have an alcoholic and they go, I'm not going to drink, I'm not going to drink, I'm not going to drink. And then they drink. And then they start putting themselves down and, oh, I'm a loser, I'm no good, I've ruined the lives of everybody around me. Oy, 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 oy. And so they make themselves feel miserable, and then the thought will occur. But there's one thing that always makes me feel better, right?
Right, yes,
Alcohol, right?
yes.
So putting yourself down is the next step toward acting out your alcoholism. It is self-defeating to do that, right?
Yes, and you have said a point that is transcendental in REBT, which is the unconditional self-acceptance, and that has totally, um, it is totally in relationship with that with which we have been speaking about, which is identity, ego, right?
Right.
And how would you define this unconditionally self-acceptance?
Yeah, I know that may sound paradoxical that I don't believe in the self, but I think we should accept it. You know, um, but I'm writing a book on this right now, so we'll see if I ever come to a conclusion here. The What I think we mean by unconditional self-acceptance is not that we like everything about ourselves, you know, not that we wouldn't want to change some aspects of the self. You know, if we're rude, maybe we want to change that based upon the consequences of rudeness, right? Must we? No, we don't have to. And at times, if we slip and we're rude, we don't need to go jump off a building, right? We can accept ourselves and move on. So it doesn't mean that you like yourself. But, you know, if you want to make those changes, it will be much easier if you accept yourself,
Mhm.
right? Rather than beating yourself all the time. Now you have to deal with not only did you do something that was not helpful, but you're beating yourself up, which is not unhelpful. So you're complicating, you know, even improving yourself and in the ways that you want to improve based upon whatever goals that you have on life. So we can unconditionally accept ourselves. Why? Because the outcomes are better. It is purely pragmatic.
What is the attitude of the REBT therapist towards the patient?
Good question. In fact, I was talking to Dr. Raymond Di Giuseppe today about just that topic, and I'm so happy that he told me that on January the 8th, he's going to be lecturing on some aspect of that when he's looking at common factors, right?
Mhm.
And REBT's view of that whole common factors debate. We do not see ourselves as the expert and that they don't have any expertise. They are the expert on themselves. We have some knowledge that would be helpful. We see ourselves as coach, that we collaborate with them based upon their values and their goals. And even if those differ from ours and we don't agree on what those values and goals will be, we will unconditionally accept them and help them overcome any of the impediments, right, from them to reach their goals. So it is this, you know, it goes beyond Carl Rogers, unconditional positive regard, you know. In fact, we don't want clients to change simply because we accept them. We want to teach them how to accept themselves unconditionally, regardless if I have a day in which I'm not liking my client. You know what I mean? That that they care about themselves. So it is that unconditional acceptance of the other person, that we are very, very curious. I think that's the biggest thing that we have on our side. We want to get the links between the cognitions and the emotions, etc. We want to get clearly what that event is. So I think we're driven by that curiosity and desire to help them based on whatever their goals are, and a realistic analysis of the impediments to them reaching those goals.
Within the therapy, there are several techniques. Um, those techniques are influenced initially from other therapy, from other school of therapies.
Right.
Also, was some of them were developed by Albert Ellis. What new techniques have appeared recently within the orthodoxical view of REBT, or within the circle of the Albert Ellis Institute? Which type of techniques are new that have appeared?
Yeah, and I think it's at the area of technique, but it's also at the area of conceptualization that it's
Mhm.
grown. And that for me is very exciting. And Al was very excited. because I think, for example, we will see the development. In fact, we will be having a workshop on this soon. The development of techniques to help individuals with personality disorders. So that may be modification of some of the techniques that we use, right?
Mhm.
Um, I remember when I was a fellow at the institute, for example, I wanted to experiment with using more inferential disputes rather than disputes of the beliefs,
Uh-huh.
particularly with borderline personality disorder, when they would often get very offended if we disputed the beliefs. And I told Albert, and he goes, "Go for it. Let's see where it goes." Right. And even when we borrow a technique from another model, we will put our own spin on it. I mean, we have the empty chair from Gestalt. We
Yeah.
have, I remember once I said, "Al, do you mind if I use a genogram?" And first he goes, "What the hell do you want to use a genogram for?" And I went, "Well, I wasn't going to, trace relationships through generation, but I wanted to trace irrational beliefs, unhelpful, dysfunctional beliefs and behaviors." He says, "Do it, see where it gets you," right? So it was always this experimental process. One of the areas that I'm very, very interested in is in neuropsych, for example, and the research on the default mode network. One thing that individuals could do if they want to read more on that is if they go to the website of the Albert Ellis Institute, there is on the drop down menu, you can get a whole listing of outcome studies on divided by topic, and you can be catch up to date on the current research in the area and techniques, etc., and outcome studies, right?
For the people that are not therapists and are watching this interview, which would be your advice for having a meaningful life?
Yeah. Well, I think one is, and it may sound like act here a little bit, but I think really becoming aware of what your values are, right? And and take an experimental approach toward life. I mean, people say, "Oh, I don't know who I am." Well, instead of worrying about that, why not just take an experimental approach and try some things and see how they go for you? Not everything will work out, but you will find out. You'll find out a lot about you, or if maybe the self is not something to find, maybe it's something to create, as the existentialists would say, right? Through
Mhm.
our choices. So I think it is hang in there, one foot in front of the other, take an experimental approach, and work on not disturbing yourself, and 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 I think one of the things that we find is look at the impediments. What are you bumping up against, right? And and then become curious about the cognitions that are doing that. And if that's hard to figure it out, go see somebody. Go see an RBT therapist. Treat them like a coach. Tell them what you want, and they'll work with you.
Great, amazing. As a final question, I would love to ask you what, uh, as president of the Albert Ellis Institute, message would you have to people that are beginning in or are getting interested in becoming a therapist, or maybe young girls, young boys that are studying psychology and thinking, oh, maybe I can become a psychotherapist. What message would you give them?
Yeah, you know, I would say, get a solid foundation in psychology, especially things like human growth and development, and sneak out of the psych department and take a logic class so that you can begin to think more clearly about some things. Um, I think neuropsych would be really important for you to take, but um, investigate several different models and keep your mind open about those. Take one of the training programs, or even take a workshop, a topic that seems interesting to you, and take a look at free YouTube of REBT action, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Christine Doyle, and you'll see her night lives, and practice sessions and just see what it's like and about that, then maybe just go to the Albert Ellis Institute website and look at what they're offering and relevant and practice it. Or go read a book. I mean, there are so many good books to read on introductory REBT that could be helpful.
You know, that's how I started. I started watching YouTube videos of Albert Ellis.
You did.
Yes, yes, yes. I was deciding about in which school um, specialize, and I was trying to find one that goes with my personality, and all of them looked like kind of funny, and I like Albert Ellis' authenticity and okay, let's go to the point, and all theory is good, right? But I saw that it was this pragmatism that is what it was about efficiency and not much about posing or just being Mr. Academic but no results, and that's what really got me. Yeah. Mr. Johnson, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. You're such an interesting person. I would love to make you 1,000 questions. And it's such an honor chatting with you. And I want to thank you in name of many psychotherapists that have formed and have a certificate by the Albert Ellis Institute. It's an honor chatting with you. And also, I hope that the work that the Albert Ellis Institute makes keeps developing in the future.
And I do want to let one last thing is we do want to hear from professionals, who may be interested in learning REBT in their area and the ways in which the Albert Ellis Institute can partner with them to get people trained in those areas. Okay?
Magnificent. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.